So with Christmas looming and presumably many of us wondering what to buy for friends and family who are resonant with some of these issues, so I thought I'd just do a short video mainly around books that I found incredibly inspiring and illuminating in recent years. And before I go into that, just to highlight a couple of documentary films that I think are incredibly accessible and worth seeing. One of which is called What's Your 2040? And I think you have to pay for it online, but not very much. Made by a young Australian filmmaker. And in a way, it's the first film to really articulate a vision for what the world could look like in 20 years' time, should we make the sort of decisions that we are presenting here to try and flip the trajectory from this very degenerative and depleting paradigm into a regenerative one. And the other film is called Biggest Little Farm. I think it's on Netflix, and follows the story of a young Californian couple moving out of LA onto an old farm that was a monoculture, extremely denuded land, and over a 7 or 8 year period building or creating a biodiverse regenerative farm. And it takes you through the trials and tribulations of that process and shows how after 7 years, having had all sorts of issues, these stabilizing homeostatic mechanisms from the ecosystem have kicked in to create these checks and balances between the sort of cooperative and competitive elements. So I think it's a really, really insightful film, very inspiring, along with What's Your 2040? And now I just want to run through a few books. I'm going to bring out the ones that I've actually got copies of here. I might reference a few books that I don't actually have copies of here, but do please look them up and for yourself and see what you think. And I'm going to start with the more sort of general overview ones, and I suppose the most comprehensive book about designing regenerative cultures, called Designing Regenerative Cultures, by Daniel Christian Wahl. And this is a really, really important book to my mind. It's the first comprehensive book that pulls all of this thinking together in a reasonably academic way, but it's very, very accessible, and I couldn't recommend it more highly. That was an incredibly influential book for me. Then, looking at food, I suppose this book by Colin Tudge, who I interviewed the other day, called 6 Steps Back to the Land, and I read this a few years ago, and it really helped to consolidate my thinking around the inefficiencies of industrial agriculture, really helped to dispel a lot of the very ingrained assumptions we have about the necessity for vast industrialized monocultures. And his new book coming out in January is called The Great Rethink, and is again a much more overview look at the underpinnings of this whole paradigm that I feel we need to reconsider and reevaluate and hopefully set onto a new trajectory. This book by Gabe Brown called From Dirt to Soil. Gabe is one of the pioneering people in the regenerative agriculture scene in Dakota, North Dakota, I think, where he inherited a family farm, got driven to the edge of bankruptcy because of all sorts of climatic disasters, and in a way, almost by default, had to start farming in this way, and over a period of time managed to show that not only could he regenerate, I think he created something like 10 inches of thriving organic topsoil over the course of a decade, and but also created an incredibly economically profitable farming model, much to the dismay of his farming neighbours. And of course the success of his project has now catalysed all sorts of other people in the area to do the same. Again, immensely readable, packed full of really, really insightful information. And while we're on that note, I don't have a copy here, but Isabella Tree's book Wilding, I think it's been out for a couple of years now, without question one of the most inspiring books I've read in many years. Beautifully, beautifully written, and it tells the story of the Burrell farm on Knepp Estate in South England, again driven to the edge of bankruptcy, and through a number of serendipitous encounters with various people pioneering this kind of thinking within the sort of conservation sector, And it really, I think, enables us to start looking and thinking about natural processes in this much more informed and systemic fashion. I could not recommend that book more highly. I can't imagine how anybody could not find that book anything but inspiring. Going on to health, this is stuff full of lots of post-it notes, but bioregulatory medicine. This is a fantastic overview of biological functional medicine, and to my mind gives us a really good idea about what we could transition to in terms of our healthcare systems without disregarding and jettisoning the incredible miraculous advances that have come through medical science in the last 100 years in terms of treating acute conditions and the need for intervention. But when treating chronic and systemic issues, these sorts of methods show much more potential efficacy. And again, I think that was a very readable and very interesting book. On the community issues, Helena Norberg Hodges' book, Local is Our Future. Helen has been a mentor, an inspiration of mine pretty much for 30 years now, and she's probably the world's leading exponent of this localization economic paradigm. And again, there's a beautiful documentary film called The Economics of Happiness, which I highly recommend watching in conjunction with this. This is a very short, highly readable book, but again, full of really pertinent information for those of us who would like to try and get more active within the local community to try and implement some of these initiatives. A very important book. Culture, and I've picked up a copy of Jeremy Lentz, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. Quite a thick book, but some quite heady stuff in there, but again beautifully synthesized and distilled into a very readable way. And I think building on, say, Fritjof Capra's work and other deep systems thinkers in this area, this is a real tour de force. And then on consciousness, we could go on forever, I suppose, but this is a recent book by Zia Tong called The Reality Bubble. And I thought this was just fascinating and revealed so many of the new insights that we now have in the last 2 or 3 decades about natural systems because of the amplification of our technologies, of not just microscopy, but also our ability to look into deep space as well. Beautifully written book, full of fascinating information, and truly one of my favourite books of recent years as well. My great friend Greg Sams, another great inspiration and mentor for me over the last 10-15 years. And this is his book about the sun, called Son of God. And the subtitle is Discovering the Self-Organizing Consciousness That Underlies Everything. I think gives you a really fascinating look about cosmology and this more kind of systemic, deeper look at consciousness itself. And actually Greg's book, which I don't have a copy of here, but his earlier book that's been republished, it was originally called Uncommon Sense, The State is Out of Date. I think it's now republished as just The State is Out of Date. And that really articulates the true politics of anarchism, a word that's often massively misinterpreted to just mean complete disorder and chaos, but comes from the etymology of that is anarchos, without a leader. And he really beautifully shows you in The State is Out of Date how many things operate beautifully within our society without the need for the interference from a centralized government. And I couldn't recommend that book more highly. I think it's really important right now. In a similar nature, Daniel Quinn's very short book, Beyond Civilization, very short, very digestible little chapters, where he really shows how the most successful form of human organization has actually been already articulated by indigenous people to some degree, and it's not advocating some kind of primitivist return to the Stone Age. It's just pointing out that the seeds for how we might start to organise ourselves on a sort of more localised bioregional level, the inspiration for that it might already be there. It correlates quite closely with my friend Bruce Parry's insights from all the time he spent with indigenous people. And actually, for those of you who would much rather read a novel around some of these ideas, Daniel Quinn's novel The Story of B, one of my favourite fiction books of recent years, and couldn't recommend that more highly, because again that really helps to convey some of these core insights. And then there were just a few other books I wanted to just bring up that could fit into any number of the topic areas. I suppose Paul Hawken's Project Drawdown book, The Most Comprehensive Plan Ever Proposed to Reverse Global Warming. And this is an absolutely staggering bit of research highlighting 100 mechanisms and initiatives and the impact that they could have on CO2 sequestration, and reveals, has some pretty interesting revelations, not least the impact of refrigeration, I think, being either number 1 or 2 within this list, but also the impact of educating particularly women in the developing world, and how the cascade effects of that can have an extraordinary impact. I think regenerative agriculture is number 8 or something, but this is just a really extraordinary bit of work, and really it gives us hope, I would say. I think this is a very interesting book when looking at the sort of psychology of all of these issues, the enormity of the challenges we face, and how we're sort of hardwired in a way to really, through this what some people call psychic numbing, to sort of anaesthetize ourselves from the enormity of these challenges, and helps us, I think, all of us to understand why we all have some resistance around all of these issues, and is immensely revealing. And this book, The Knowledge by Lewis Dartnell, How to Rebuild Our World After an Apocalypse. And I think I always want to highlight the fact that what we're trying to present here is not like a prepper's survivalist guide to this sort of Mad Max sort of post-apocalyptic world, but I think it is an incredible sort of polymath academic who's managed to distill so much information, fascinating read about what it would require to reboot many of the systems that we currently take for granted. And finally, Joseph Tainter's book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, is probably the go-to book around the theories of collapse. Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, also obviously being another pertinent one in this area. And I'd also just like to mention Rebecca Solnit, Paradise Built in Hell, where she travelled the globe and talked to lots of people in disaster areas, whether it was Hurricane Katrina or the Indian Ocean tsunami. And it's, again, a very revealing insight into how communities can actually coalesce and come together in the face of adversity, and this notion that things are going to just break down into this kind of sort of Cormac McCarthy, The Road, sort of Mad Max dystopia is probably a very fabricated projection about human nature and the way things could go. I'm not saying that some of that might not happen in the face of collapse, but I think we also need to hold on to the fact that the evidence suggests that in the wake of collapse, the general tendency is for people to come together rather than fragment. And I personally witnessed that firsthand in the wake of the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, 2005, 2006, where I was in South Sri Lanka, having just moved there, and saw these communities composed of Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims and Christians, expats, all coming together, all working together under a common goal. Of course, there were incidents, but by and large, the ability for those communities to come together was incredibly pronounced and incredibly obvious. In a way, in stark contrast to Hurricane Katrina, that actually these more advanced Western civilizations, where communities have become more fragmented, were less able to come together in the face of big challenges. So I could go on forever probably with all sorts of other books, but hopefully there's a bit of inspiration there for some reading material over the festive season, and things to maybe put in front of friends and family who are resonant with some of these issues, but keen to go a little bit deeper. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope that was useful. Thank you.